All right, well, why don't we get started? And just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will end when the Q&A session starts. Thank you for participating and attending this webinar. If you're here for the Global Rights Compliance Report on critical mineral supply chains and state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region, then congratulations, you're in the right place. If that is not where you expected to be, then it's already in your diary. You're already here. So I encourage you to stay because I promise that it will be worth your while. I'm Samir Goswami. I'm the director of the Forced Labor Program at Global Rights Compliance. GRC is an international law and development firm based in the Netherlands with an aim to seek justice through the innovative application of international law. One of GRC's core divisions is focused on business and human rights, led by Lara Strangways, advising governments, companies, and institutional investors on what it takes to conduct meaningful human rights due diligence in high-risk jurisdictions or challenging contexts. And this project on state-imposed forced labor is one of our key projects. Now, for some details on how today will go before we launch into it, again, this session is being recorded. The Q&A at the end of the session will not be recorded. Each panelist will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and we've got some great panelists lined up. You will undoubtedly have some questions. Please use the Q&A function that's on the bottom bar of your Zoom to post those. We have time towards the end to discuss those questions, and you can ask the questions anonymously, or you can post your affiliation. It's your preference. Please do let us know which panelist you would like to direct the question to. If you don't, I will just pick randomly. And we will, again, only be recording the speakers' presentations, and we'll turn the recording off during the Q&A session, and we'll share the recording in the following days. Before we delve in, I really would like to recognize the GRC team members who have made all this happen. Again, the BHR team, the Business Human Rights team at GRC is led by Lara Strangways. And a massive thank you to Caroline Dale, who you will hear from today, one of our principal researchers, Jusara Paiman, Penny Karageorgi, and Edie Martin on the GRC team. And we're also very grateful to Dr. Laura Murphy, who has been advising us and has just provided us some incredible advice. And I also must note that we were very fortunate to have a few researchers in China who are remaining anonymous for their own safety, who provided some key research assistance as well. The report that we're discussing today on critical mineral supply chains came out in June and has gained significant attention in the press, over 150 or so articles, and including right away from the Chinese government, who denounced it almost immediately. So you can take that how you will. Many of us here take that as quite validating. Let's just start with some grounding. How Uyghur people are being treated by the PRC is genocide, flat out. Uyghur people are subjected to arbitrary incarceration, forced labor, family separation, and forced sterilization. And this exploited labor at a massive scale ends up in Western supply chains. Some of the goods that we trace this exploitation to includes coffee mugs, electric vehicles, power tools, components for spacecraft, and household and commercial paint. Specifically, we looked at 4 critical minerals with a large manufacturing presence in the region: titanium, lithium, beryllium, and magnesium. And Caroline will go into detail about those minerals. Specifically, we found that there were 77 companies operating in critical minerals or manufacturing mineral-based products in the Uyghur region, 15 companies directly sourcing from those entities, and we found 68 international customers of those Chinese suppliers. I do like to always point out that it's a dual threat of labor and environmental exploitation. Coal is an abundant energy resource in the Uyghur region, and while we race to procure critical minerals that go into solar panels, electrical car batteries, and other green technologies, the production and processing of that is done by exploited labor and powered by energy from burning coal. So let's get into it. We have a great lineup for today, and we'll start with Yalkun Uluyol. Yalkun is the China researcher at Human Rights Watch, focusing on a wide range of topics. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, he was a researcher for the Forced Labor Lab at Sheffield Hallam University and co-founder of Uyghur Rights Monitor. Note that Yalkun will be joining for the first half of this session, and unfortunately may not be able to stay for the Q&A session, but if there are questions for him, we can always send them to him and send them back to all to you as well. Thank you, Yalkun, for joining us, and on to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Samir, for the invitation and Global Rights Compliance for the amazing report and also the webinar today. That is shedding light on one of the significant issues that Uyghur people, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other people in the Uyghur region face today. So I'll try to talk about the human rights violations in China, in the Uyghur region, specifically committed by the Chinese government since late 2016. That may amount to crimes against humanity, according to a report that is published by Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2022, and also a wide range of other research and investigations, on the issue that we are trying to talk about today. And I will also try to talk about the nature of state-imposed forced labor and how that is different from other forms of forced labor, and why we should pay extra attention to state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region. And also towards the end, I will also try to lay out why and how the Chinese government is trying to shrink the space for fact-finding organizations and researchers and academics through various forms of transnational repression. So I'll start by talking about the general situation in the Uyghur region. And for the starters, who are Uyghurs? Right? Uyghur people, according to Chinese government official statistics, are about 13 million people who are living in the northwest part of China that is officially called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which I will refer to as Uyghur region in my presentation today. And Uyghur region accounts to about 1/5 of China's total landmass, with a border with 8 other countries, all the way from Russia on the north to India in the south. And Uyghur region is rich with resources. That includes 40% of China's coal reserve, about 30% of natural gas, 10% of global aluminum, about 35% of polysilicon production that ends up in solar panels. Statistics from 2023, if I'm not mistaken, and also 25% of global cotton production. Right, and I can count many other products that are coming out of the Uyghur region, but that's not what I am talking about today. But rather, I want to talk about how the Chinese government has targeted Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in the Uyghur region since late 2016 with the Strike Hard campaign. And Strike Hard campaign came at a time where many Uyghurs suddenly started disappearing. And according to estimates, up to 1 million people were arbitrarily detained by the Chinese authorities into internment camps, which they call re-education facilities. And initially, Chinese government denied the existence of such facilities, but later, with increasing evidence about satellite imagery, expansion of internment camps, and also evidence from international community and Uyghur diaspora members, asking whereabouts of their family members, Chinese government finally admitted the existence of such facilities in 2018. And then after a couple of years, Chinese government said, hey, we have released people from the detention facilities. However, that's not really happened on the ground. So that brings me to the general concept of state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region. And I want to correct misperception about state-imposed forced labor. It's not only about forced labor in the camps that I have just described, right? State-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region can take in different forms. It can be a prison labor. It can be a detention facility related labor. It can also be forced labor in industrial parks all across the Uyghur region. It can also be forced labor facilities located in other parts of China. It can also include the massive state-sponsored labor transfer programs that, according to Chinese government official figures, from 2022 and 2023 affected more than 3 million people in total. And remember, Uyghur population announced by China is about 13 million, and more than 3 million is a significant portion of the total population of Uyghurs, right? And that is massive in number. And one person may be transferred more than once, and they are transferred across facilities according to latest research by New York Times and other investigative journalists. And it can involve entities and governments that are state-owned, but it can also involve private enterprises that are operating in the Uyghur region or beyond the Uyghur region. And that poses a challenge because Chinese government incentivizes those enterprises to move into the Uyghur region because of the cheap labor, low environmental standards, and also abusive practices the Chinese government has set there since 2016, especially during the strike hard campaign. And I have started my sentence by saying, calling out and reiterating the findings of UN Office of High Commissioner's report from 2022, that I quote, the practices in the Uyghur region may amount to international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. And Human Rights Watch has documented, how Chinese government policies have affected the lives of Uyghurs, how Chinese government has considered Uyghurs who are just being Uyghur as having individuals with ideological viruses. And we have also analyzed how Chinese government uses high level of surveillance technologies to control everyday life of Uyghurs in the Uyghur region. And this is a region where China is committing crimes against humanity, and it has become extremely hard and difficult for companies to operate without being complicit in those abusive practices. And that's why, in our investigation focusing on aluminum sector and how that aluminum from the Uyghur region ends up in global car brands, a report that we have released last year, we called for car companies to source responsibility. And if you cannot operate in the Uyghur region, then exit responsibly from the Uyghur region. And that probably you will hear from Global Rights Compliance's latest report and how the sectors are evolving and latest practices and practice of state imposed forced labor and sectors that we have not examined before. And lastly, I also want to reiterate the importance of fact-finding work, research, investigations related to forced labor. Chinese government, with its all efforts, trying to silence activists, critics, researchers work on China, and at the same time trying to promote its own narrative around the issue related to Uyghurs. And Chinese government is trying to promote this alternative narrative about Uyghurs, alternative narrative about the Uyghur region in general, and denying the facts that are found at the highest level of UN High Commissioner of Human Rights. And Chinese government is refusing to implement recommendations from the UN, but rather they are trying to promote this alternative narrative about how things are normal in the Uyghur region. And they are doing it through two ways. On the one hand, they are trying to silence critics, activists, researchers, and on the other hand, they're trying to promote their own narrative. Right? In this scenario, it is important for us to acknowledge the hard work of researchers who work on those issues and expose the abuses and their linkage to global markets. And we have seen how forced labor regulations make a change, and we have seen and advocated for forced labor regulation all across the globe, including the EU, UK, and the United States. And we have Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States that is one of the strongest, if not one of the most strongest, the most strong and strongest forced labor regulation ever exists. And we are urging other governments to take measures against those state-imposed forced labor practices. And lastly, I want to conclude by highlighting that state-imposed forced labor is extreme and severe form of forced labor. When a government like China knocks your door and asks you to go and work at a factory, little or no paid, you have no right to say no. And if you say no, there are repercussions that you might face, and that might put you in a detention facility or in prison even. And that is the most critical part, that we have to remember that those Uyghurs who are working in those facilities have no choice to say no. And that is why state-imposed forced labor is critical in evaluating and addressing overall systematic abuses in the Uyghur region. And thank you for participating. And I will hand over to Samir, back to you. I will try to stay as much as I can for the questions, but otherwise, you know where to find me. Thank you.
Yalkun, I cannot thank you enough. I know you're juggling a few things, so thank you for making the time and just for contextualizing all that we're talking about today to the people. I know it's very personal to you as well, and I just want to reiterate something you said, which I'm probably paraphrasing at this point. If you can't guarantee human rights, then exit responsibly from the Uyghur region. I will think about that quote for a while. Now let's move on to hear about the findings from the report, and I'll turn it over to Caroline Dale, GRC's principal researcher on the project, and we'll dive into some of our key findings. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Samir. My name is Caroline Dale. As Samir mentioned, I am the principal researcher on this project, and I am thrilled to be sharing our findings with you today. And thank you again to Dr. Uluyol. I was fortunate enough to work with him in the early days of this research, and his insights have always been invaluable. I just want to reiterate the same point that he's made, that behind all of these findings, behind what will sometimes get into some technical language and dynamics, are human stories. All of the entities that we've identified within the Uyghur region that are included within this report have participated in poverty alleviation and labor transfer schemes that, as Yalkun mentioned, are an intrinsic part of the systemic repression happening in the region. So as we bear that in mind, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So just to outline the 4 minerals that we focused on in this report, our beryllium and lithium I've put together because these co-occur. They occur in the same ores and in the same mines within the Uyghur region. Lithium, to begin, is obviously a well-recognized critical mineral and a well-recognized priority across many countries. Within the Uyghur region, it is actually known as the birthplace of lithium and birthplace of China's lithium industry, because back in the 1950s, the predecessor to Xinjiang non-ferrous, Xinjiang lithium salt, began operating in the 1950s to mine for materials that were ultimately used to develop the PRC's military programs, including atomic testing and hydrogen bombs. That industry, the resources were eventually exhausted, and up until about 2022, the region was not yet producing lithium in a meaningful or commercially scalable volume whatsoever. With a push for investment coming from the PRC and shifting production and energy-intensive and labor-intensive industries in particular toward the Uyghur region, that prompted major investments by some of the largest lithium producers in the country, driving investments both in the extraction as well as in the processing of lithium within the region, and downstream production industries being formed, particularly, as Dr. Uluyol mentioned, within industrial parks and economic development zones. So we will get into some of the findings related to those specific products, as well as the companies involved. But the number that you see here is a representation of 1% of the global production share of LCE. That should be understood as really the starting point for what is set to be a significant expansion, both utilizing the domestic resources within the region, as well as utilizing external raw materials for the processing capacity to be met within the region's possibility. Beryllium is a strategic mineral with extremely advanced applications, largely because it's expensive and dangerous to process. Historically, the PRC, along with the United States and Kazakhstan, are the only 3 countries that process and further manufacture beryllium products. The PRC currently accounts for about 21% of the global production. 11% of that, about 50% of the country's production, is concentrated within the Uyghur region. And we'll get into more details about what those occupational safety hazards look like in operation, as well as some of the downstream applications beyond just military and defense applications that are relevant to daily life. With magnesium and titanium, these are oftentimes co-processed within the region. There are facilities that are set up to rely on the energy sources required for both, as they're both extremely energy intensive. Magnesium is significant in large part because of the near exclusive control of the PRC over magnesium smelting in the global market. That 5.5% of global production that is represented by the Uyghur region actually represents a near doubling of the output of the region from 2023, and the anticipation of a doubling again in 2025, putting the percentage of global smelted production at an estimated near 10%. With that expansion comes an extreme level of vulnerability across multiple industries, including aluminum, automotive, and other manufacturing industries that rely on refractory materials, of exposure to, in their supply chains, to labor in the Uyghur region. And finally, we'll discuss titanium. Titanium is well established within the region, including intellectual property as well as production facilities. There is a vertically integrated titanium metal production supply chain, as well as investments from Eastern regions and entities in the East who are extremely significant in the titanium dioxide industry. We've identified an 11.6% market share for titanium sponge coming out of the Uyghur region. And that is an extremely significant number, in part because titanium sponge is so significant for titanium metal production. It's the feedstock necessary, and titanium metal, as we seek to not only construct defense and military applications, but also lightweighting automobiles and aerospace. That titanium sponge is increasingly vital to the global economy, as well as to many of the aspirational aspects of the energy transition, as well as some of our advanced technologies. Titanium concentrate is the feedstock for titanium dioxide, which I'll explain a bit more in the context of those downstream products as we dig in. If you go to the next slide. Great. Excuse me. Just a note on terminology. Critical minerals is not a global term. There is no single definition for critical minerals. And while that's the phrase that we use in the US, in the PRC, strategic minerals are the term of art that are used there. And we'll, as I switch back and forth, I'll be sure to specify which I'm talking about. But this is just a high-level overview demonstrating that major economies throughout the world, in particular those that have established critical minerals lists, many of which in the last couple of years, widely recognize these four minerals as being critical or strategic to their national interest. So as we move through, keep in mind that these are high priorities across major economies, and therefore there's this exposure as we have increased capacity within the region and increased exposure in global supply chains that flow through or have a nexus to that production. We can go to the next slide. So our first mineral I'm going to discuss is lithium. As I mentioned, the lithium industry is sort of in a stage of revival within the region. That is in part because of the discovery and investments in exploration for lithium reserves. These reserves exist at an extremely high altitude, one that requires specific oxygen masks and is extremely challenging to construct and access logistically for both the extractive process as well as the downstream processing. This industry has seen significant investments, and so the snapshot that we have of 2024 really represents this sort of rebirth of the industry that's happening. And I anticipate that within the next 6 months, and certainly already in the first 6 months of this year, that there has been a significant expansion in production capacity within the region. These are often the product of vertically integrated firms in public-private partnerships coming from the East. There are significant benefits associated with investment in the Uyghur region's lithium industry. That can include subsidies, that can include guaranteed resources, i.e., the government assuring companies making that investment that even if enough lithium is not extracted from domestic resources, they will provide raw materials for that processing, essentially assuring that there are external raw materials, usually Australian lithium, coming in for processing within the region. That rapid expansion of processing has also fed into the expansion and extension of the lithium-ion battery chain within the region, particularly in specific industrial parks and economic regions. There's an example here. Jiangxi Motors is a company that has followed that same verticalization model. They've established 3 new subsidiaries within the region, as well as manufacturing facilities for e-bike motors. They're a massive producer of other sorts of e-mobility products, including an e-scooter pictured on the right. But really, lithium-ion batteries, as we know, are ubiquitous within consumer electronics and electric vehicles and nearly every other user electricity-powered consumer good. And so while this is not yet a fully expanded and fully matured industry within the region, the risk of exposure is dramatic and is one that we can begin to combat now by making this a priority of developing resources outside the region. We can go. Perfect. As I mentioned, because this is such a nascent industry, while it has has allowed companies from the East to launch their investments and some to launch to commercial capacity. As of 2024, only 3 entities within the region were actually producing at a commercially scalable volume. That has already changed in 2025. So this map, I anticipate, will look significantly larger and more complex within the 2025 span when we revisit these numbers. You can go to the next slide. Beryllium is a favorite of mine. I'm not sure why we put beryllium twice in the Chinese script, but beryllium, as I mentioned, is only produced by 3 countries. It is extremely hazardous to extract. It causes lung cancer and berylliosis. And up until a couple of years ago, within the region in particular, it was recognized as a constant and standing occupational hazard. And while there have been efforts to try and revive the efficiency of the facility, those health hazards have only been treated within the context of that efficiency and business case. Unsurprisingly, that has not subsided the labor transfers that the largest entity engaged in beryllium processing have utilized throughout the last 5 to 7 years, as well as the parent companies and Xinjiang non-ferrous, whose abuses have been well documented within the region. While beryllium is used for very advanced purposes, in particular, non-spark tools were a product that we identified with direct ties to the Uyghur region and being exported to markets like India and Vietnam. Spark-proof tools are utilized in sectors like oil and gas, in mining, and in space. So they are extremely advanced tools indeed, and for specialized industrial use, but are entering global markets, especially in these higher priority areas. There is also nuclear-grade beryllium fluoride, which is produced in the Uyghur region. It is actually exclusively produced by one supplier within the region, and that is the basis, that is the energy source and a necessary component for the advanced nuclear energy generation that the PRC is pursuing. We can go to the next slide. And this is a look at the spark-proof tools, as I've referenced before, as downstream customers and the industries that purchase these. And the list of companies here ranges pretty widely on the industrial uses downstream, as well as Xinjiang non-ferrous. Beryllium's primary alloying use is as beryllium copper. Beryllium copper is what's used in those spark-proof tools as well. And so there is overlap between other Xinjiang non-ferrous subsidiaries, including those on the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force UFLPA entity list. All right, we can go to the next slide. Alrighty. Magnesium, as we discussed, is about 5.5% of the global production is coming out of the Uyghur region. But of course, because of the PRC's near total control of smelted magnesium production, the risk of exposure puts the world at about 5%. That is a representation of both military and civil fusion projects that include XPCC projects, expanding magnesium production, as well as public-private partnerships with a major commodities trader within the PRC that owns an extensive network of subsidiaries across industries that has invested through a joint venture with the regional government in expanding the region's magnesium production. So one of the primary uses for magnesium is as a refractory material, in particular for aluminum. Our colleagues at Human Rights Watch, as well as in other organizations, have already documented clearly the connections between the aluminum industry within the region and state-imposed labor transfers. And so there's this overlap that happens across a lot of these minerals, including magnesium as a necessary component for titanium processing, which I'll mention in just a moment. Those downstream industries also include fertilizers, so used for agriculture, and include wholly foreign-owned entities, including by Hong Kong ownership. So the magnesium industry is continuing to expand. It has been a point of investment promotion of the local government. And it also continues to be a point of extreme sensitivity, both for simply downstream market consumption, but also for the automotive industry in particular. So the tires on your car and the steering wheel in particular are almost always going to have magnesium as a part of the alloy material. All right, we can go to the next. So this is Xinjiang Banjiao Group is the XPCC entity that I referenced. These represent steel and aluminum companies that are purchasers of that magnesium produced by Xinjiang Banjiao that range throughout the PRC as well as within the region. This obviously presents some traceability challenges as when you're dealing with a refractory material, it can be a very low percentage, very low volume, and oftentimes is being consumed domestically within the PRC. Okay, and our last mineral. Great. Titanium is the mineral where we were able to do the most extensive downstream tracing, in large part because the major titanium producers within the region seem to operate pretty seamlessly within Western markets, including appearances at expo shows for aerospace and for consumer goods, without any real effort to conceal the origin of their company or of their products. The PRC is the world's leading producer and consumer of titanium. Again, that poses a similar traceability challenge as we face with magnesium, where there's a lot of domestic consumption of what is being produced. However, as there has been an increasing surplus and growing capacity, in particular from the region within the PRC, titanium sponge has become an increasing focus of exports as well as titanium metals, all of which are produced within the same verticalized supply chain and in the same industrial park by the same series of subsidiaries. Titanium processing is largely controlled by a group called Hunan Wuzhou Light Chemical Group. That is another massive commodities and diversified industry trader within the PRC. In particular, they're known as the second largest producer of titanium insulated cups. Or of insulated cups generally speaking, because there's this sort of twofold overlap with titanium cups where you have metal being utilized oftentimes in the exterior, but also titanium dioxide is used for the insulated glass inside of those cups and other forms of insulation, in particular because of its properties for thermal maintenance. It's the same thing that also makes it valuable for instance, in industrial coatings. So between insulated cups and thermoses, as well as nonstick pans and ceramic cookware, we identified some significant downstream customers purchasing titanium that almost certainly, or that has a direct point of exposure to the region. The titanium dioxide supply chain also extends down into paints and coatings, oftentimes for commercial use, but also industrial applications, in particular coatings for industrial applications, as well as in sort of decorative paints, again, refractory materials used for construction or for automotive paints, automotive parts, as well as ship construction. It's also used it's a vital component of the renewable energy targets that many countries have set for themselves. It's a necessary input for nuclear and hydrogen power generation, as well as for aerospace and defense, and has a role even in lithium-ion batteries in the battery casings. So titanium has a very expansive footprint within the global market, and in particular, the expanding capacity within the Uyghur region, along with the expanding sort of footprint within the intellectual property space. Patents and applications that have been filed by these major firms operating in the region range in the hundreds as compared to about 25% of that in other markets. So not only is there a significant market share that exists now, but increasingly the global market is becoming captive to the supply chain as geopolitical changes adjust supply chain access, and increasingly the sophistication of the titanium sponge being produced in particular within the region reaches the level of aerospace qualification and other advanced downstream industries. So if you will skip the next slide and we'll go to the one after that. Perfect. So here's a look at the titanium metal downstream that we have identified. This is through public shipping records. These are generally speaking manufacturers and of industrial materials, oftentimes coils, heat exchangers, and other components that are utilized for energy generation that have wide varieties of sectors that have similar applications, but have specialized uses, in particular for titanium, which is often referred to as an exotic metal, which I like. You can go to the next slide. This is the titanium dioxide supply chain that we've discussed. As I mentioned, the titanium dioxide that is exported with potential exposure to the Uyghur region, in fact, is ubiquitous, right? The companies shown here are companies that paint your car, that paint the London Eye, that provide the paint for your home. I have purchased from these brands for my own house. And so it's one of those things where around you, there's this sort of extensive, I see minerals everywhere at this point. But there is this very real position that consumers have been put in of potential exposure between their coffee cup in the morning and the paint that they put on their house in the afternoon and the car that they drive home at night. And so I hope that this will be a real reminder, both to consumers as well as to governments and to industry, that there is a need for this kind of deep tracing and getting to the absolute raw materials, especially as these industries expand within the region. All righty, and with that, I will pass it back to Samir.
Thank you, Caroline. Really appreciate that. I know there's a lot more information that you can share, and we appreciate the succinctness of it. And my takeaway, of course, is two things. One is Caroline has a lot of knowledge, and she herself is powered by Pepsi, from what I could tell. And then also, I think your last point that one may not think about titanium, lithium, beryllium, and magnesium, but it really is everywhere. It's in all the products that we use. And I think our personal challenge is that every time we use one of those products, we should also think about the human rights implications of our use of those products. So thank you, Caroline, very much appreciate that. For our next speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce Rahima Mahmut. She's a leading Uyghur human rights campaigner, translator, and the executive director of Stop Uyghur Genocide. I also just recently learned that she's also a singer, and I really hope there are some YouTube clips of you singing. Rahima is based in the UK. She has played a key role in raising awareness of the genocide in the Uyghur region, including leading impactful campaigns in the UK Parliament, calling for sanctions, import bans, and recognition of the atrocities as genocide. She will dive into her work with Stop Uyghur Genocide. Rahima, thank you so much for being part of this today.
Thank you, and thanks for that very kind introduction, and thank you for having me. As Yalkun has already spoken so powerfully about the reality facing Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples in the region, I won't repeat. I speak today not to describe the abuses, but to underscore the urgency of action. We are far past the point of awareness. The evidence is clear, the testimonies are overwhelming, and the moral imperative is undeniable. What we need now is accountability, and that means action from governments, corporations, and all of us. As Executive Director of Stop Uyghur Genocide, I have spent years working with survivors, interpreting their testimonies, and campaigning for concrete policy change here in the UK. Our organization has led successful campaigns calling for import bans on goods tainted by Uyghur forced labor. We've been pushing for stronger due diligence laws, parliamentary action, and corporate transparency. We were part of the case that led to last year's landmark UK High Court ruling that recognized the criminal risk of importing cotton linked to forced labor. This new risk at the source report lays bare how forced labor is embedded in China's critical mineral strategy. Minerals like titanium, lithium, magnesium, and beryllium, many sourced from the Uyghur region, are entering global supply chains through coercion and control. These are not isolated cases. This is state-imposed system of forced labor. Companies cannot credibly audit their supply chains in the region, and that is why voluntary measures are failing. What we need now is policy with teeth. Stop Uyghur Genocide will be leading this critical minerals campaign in the UK. And today I want to outline our key demands. One, legislation that enforces a ban on imports of goods linked to Uyghur forced labor, including critical minerals, polysilicon, and other high-risk inputs. 2, a legal presumption of risk for all goods and materials sourced from the Uyghur region unless proven otherwise by independent, variable evidence. 3, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws with real enforcement to make business legally accountable across their entire supply chains. 4, public procurement policies that cut ties with companies complicit in state-imposed forced labor. No public contract, subsidies, or government funding should be spent on goods connected to forced labor. Lastly, create an independent monitoring body. The UK should work with EU to establish a UK and EU-wide enforcement body with the power to investigate, audit, and penalize companies violating forced labor standards. But this campaign cannot be fought in policy circles alone. We need the support of the public, of everyone who believes that clean energy must also mean clean ethics. So I ask you today, share this report, speak to your MPs, write to the brands you buy from, support the organizations fighting this abuse, and help us build pressure that cannot be ignored. Thank you.
Rahima, thank you so much for that, that very powerful closing to our panels. And I just want to underscore what you said about the urgency of action and how we are far past the point of awareness. And it really is a time for action. So really appreciate that. I think we will now stop the recording and move to the Q&A. And before we start the Q&A, I just want to make one correction. Earlier on, when I introduced the panel, I said that we had some researchers in China that choose to remain anonymous. Our researchers are not in China that we've consulted with. They're outside of China, but they still choose to remain anonymous, which I think underscores the threats that many folks who are advocates and researchers in this field face.